to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jackie Dupont. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And it is Friday, which means we're having another edition of our segment, the Redspin Report, where we discuss sports, politics, and struggle with Nate Wallace, the co-host of the Redspin Sports podcast. Nate, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Sean and Wyatt, how's it going this morning?
Doing well. And a tragic story, I think, to start with here today, Nate, talking about a former NFL player, Phillip Adams, who, according to reports, killed himself after killing 5 people in South Carolina. I was hoping you could begin by sort of telling us about Phillip Adams and what happened here.
Sure. So there's more stuff that's coming out just rapidly with this. And if you want to see the cesspool of the internet, you can go to Twitter and look up Phillip Adams' motive. But there is actually some concrete information that's starting to come out. I mean, the facts we know, Phillip Adams was born in 1988 in Rock Hill, South Carolina, which is a suburb of Charlotte, which is just across the border in South Carolina from Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, which is where Charlotte is. And he went to South Carolina State University, which is the biggest HBCU in the state there, was drafted by the San Francisco 49ers following his finish, I think it was in 2010. He was a workout freak. I mean, actually, of all places, Fox News actually released an article this morning that really kind of goes into some of the potential motives, but really also dives into just his background and really how much he struggled with the loss of football. And it's something we talk about a lot, sort of with a ultra competitive capitalist sport, especially here in the United States. And when you build up your identity for your entire life and you've been, a star, you've been a player that's reached the pinnacle performance, and then you've also suffered a combination of, but then that's taken away. It ends for everybody, and it's not a normal career. And it's kind of why I try to point out that when people talk about how much these players make, quote unquote, and are upset about, all these salaries are so big, obviously missing the point about how much owners are making, but also how short their careers are. So you have a young man here who's, you listen to his agent talk, the people that knew him. He said his agent said that he had an injury his rookie year. Some teams wrote him off, and he had that stigma of a guy who was hurt. His ability was better than a guy who bounced around a lot. All that weighed on him heavily. He had 6 years, a great career, but he felt he had more. It was hard for him to walk away from the game, especially a guy as dedicated as he was. Casterling, his former agent, said that he had a tendency to cut off from the world when he was hurting. Casterling goes on to say that we encouraged him to explore all of his disability options, and he wanted to do it. He would isolate, but that's who he was, so it wasn't a big concern. I knew he was hurting and missing football, but he wouldn't take health tips offered to him. He said he would, but he wouldn't. I felt he was lost without football, somewhat depressed, but he was really hard to follow because he would isolate. He goes on to talk about how much he was working out 3 times a day constantly, even after football was over, talking about which to me points to an inability to move on, a delusion of thinking that you're still going to somehow resurrect a career that clearly at this point he hadn't played in the league since 2015 was over. Other than that, we know that he lived less than a quarter mile from the doctor, Dr. Robert Leslie, and his wife and family, where he ended up. We don't know the exact motives. There's a lot of speculation. It's a patient relationship. It hasn't been confirmed yet. But it gets to this larger issue. And as you all pointed out and sent me about, what President Joe Biden is saying now about gun violence and being a national epidemic and being an international embarrassment, even, looking at the way the U.S. likes to call other nations and the U.S. being a hegemonic power and always speaking down to other nations about human rights abuses and their own issues and whatnot. Of course, in the case of China, we pointed out so many of those are just projection, but we clearly do not have our house in order here. And I think this is just further evidence of that. Not to mention Travis Rudolph, which I'm sure we'll get to.
Yeah, the Travis Rudolph is obviously another just horrific incident of gun violence. Similar situation, similar kind of story. I do want to draw attention, Nate, to comments that President Biden made yesterday as he was discussing his executive actions that he's taking on gun control. He said, he got word that in South Carolina that this killing had happened, and he said gun violence in this country is an epidemic, and it's an international embarrassment. And yeah, I found that kind of interesting in the sense of, well, yeah, I mean, it is an international embarrassment. The level of gun violence in this country is absurd. It's kind of a sort of a stereotype that people in other countries have. It's just that it's kind of like the Wild West in the United States. But I found that kind of grating, to be honest, that because to me it sort of betrays this tendency of the Biden administration now really to only seem to care about these issues through the lens of how they reflect on the U.S.'s international standing. Because, I mean, sure, it's an international embarrassment. It's also a horrific tragedy. It's not just for the player, for the family, for obviously the family that has suffered so many losses. I can't help but think, this is really kind of an instance in which the crime is this horrific incident is, it's already, I think, getting lumped into, these kind of narratives of mental health. And I think it's probably pretty safe to say that there is some relation to the football career. Just in terms of how many times can you take hits over and over and over again, dozens of times a day, that are effectively the same level of force as like a fly on a freight train sometimes. I mean, eventually that, of course, is going to have some action on your decision-making abilities. But, I kind of want to get into what that's been like for you, Nate, playing football for so many years, knowing people who have been dealing with these kinds of traumatic brain injuries. How have you seen that affect people's lives?
Yeah, I mean, you see it in a variety of ways. I mean, it's so much of the machismo and so much of the culture is built around that you see with Phillip Adams, wanting to say, oh, I'm all right, not wanting to. You sort of internalize this idea, whether it's head injuries or other kind of injuries, that it's a sort of a warrior class like ethos, I guess you kind of you sort of take on unconsciously over time, that your sort of your masculinity, the pride you take in yourself is in part predicated on the ability to continue to march on in spite of pain. And I think that's definitely one of the more toxic elements. I think it's really important to note the reaction of Phillip Adams' father too, and just sort of like understanding this. I mean, the way he was like, I thought reporters were overzealous and asking him, "Were you there when, were you one of the people?" I guess they got to do their job in some sense, but the man's grieving. But I mean, to the Biden point, it's just like I really, it just frustrates me because again, we go through, it's like a narrative that just replays itself every time one of these things happens. And there would have been nothing about gun control that Biden's proposing that would have done a thing with the save Dr. Robert Leslie's life. This wasn't about bump stocks and the magazine rounds and like background checks and all that kind of stuff. I mean, look, I'm not saying that it's completely not important at all, but I do think in a country that is where there's more guns than people, where it's very difficult, to put it mildly, to trust law enforcement to be the arbiters of conflict resolution, and as we just see with countless examples, the idea that it's just such a cop out by the ruling class and the Democratic Party specifically, which really pushes this issue because it enables them. Why aren't we talking about Medicare for all? Why aren't we talking about the fact that you have players that don't have lifetime health care benefits, and that's something that is a major concern. Now, granted, you have this player, the agent, talking about him not wanting to accept help, right, and isolating. I can only imagine that COVID this last year certainly probably didn't have a good effect on that either. But we have so many levels of pathologies in our society built in. I mean, all the class antagonisms, the racist law enforcement, and that history and the current reality that still persists. All that's tied in. And then Biden, you're right, is worried about how this looks on the U.S. internationally. it's galling, really. I mean, and that's sort of where his mind goes. But nonetheless, with Travis Rudolph, think of a guy who is a domestic dispute sort of thing. This is a guy that was a superstar receiver out of the Palm Beach County area, went to Florida State, was noted for doing like so much good work with charitable stuff, spending time with kids and all. And his father was just killed senselessly, like as a worker, had a lawn service by some guy shooting an AK-47 in another room in 2017, and then just like him just getting hit and dying. I mean, just what would that do to your mental state? I mean, it's just unspeakable. I mean, Rudolph played a little bit in the NFL, had been in the CFL recently, and he went, chasing this person down the street. He had a domestic dispute, and there were multiple people shot. One person's been killed. It started off that he had been having a dispute with his girlfriend. It's just the levels of tragedy here just cascade and just are like one on top of another. But I mean, I really, really find it just going back to the Biden thing and the way that this all gets framed, and then the whole trope about mental health. It goes back to like it creates this situation where we're essentially stigmatizing people with mental health, because it's like every person with any kind of mental health issue is a potential shooter, just waiting to be triggered, I guess, so to speak. And it's like, that is just not cool. And it's a way to deflect attention from the pathologies that are inherent in this society, and which is that everything's commodified, everything's based on profit, down to housing, down to healthcare. There's nothing that's just like you as a human being with dignity. So all this talk about coming together and unity and, what is going on with these tragedies, like, wake up and look in the mirror, middle class America. Like, it's until you realize that it's a system problem, we're going to keep having this horror show repeat itself in different manifestations.
Yeah, and we've been talking about just that issue, Nate, about how every time there's a mass shooting, we see these same lukewarm measures and whatnot from the government as of now, certainly under a Democratic administration, that don't even scratch the surface on the real issue at hand. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you excuse me. I think you hit the nail on the head when you touched on just the profound isolation that the capitalist system creates in people. And that, I think, has only been intensified by the reality of the coronavirus pandemic. And so we're living in a society that already has these deep contradictions in all these issues. And you basically have just gasoline just dumped all over that, with the way that this pandemic has just been criminally mismanaged by the ruling class. Well, I guess maybe mismanaged isn't actually accurate. I think it's more accurate to say about how the ruling class chose to abandon poor working and oppressed people under the pandemic. And I feel like so much of what we're seeing now, even though we saw it before the coronavirus, I think, honestly, part of what we're seeing is sort of the consequence of that. And it's almost like, a boiling pot that is now overflowing. And so the real sort of contradictions of the system are just being laid out in ways that are quite literally deadly.
No doubt. And just to continue to highlight your point and build on that, I mean, going back to that Fox News article that dropped this morning, it talked about Adams having suffered 2 concussions, and that we're not knowing about the what the long-lasting effects are from that. But it's also important to note that since he hadn't retired by 2014, he will not be eligible for testing as part of the broad-based settlement between the league and the players' union over such injuries involving head injuries. There is, I guess, the family could, that's okay and something they want to do. But that was part of the settlement, that it was about pre-2014. So do not expect that there's going to be necessarily post-mortem look at the brain and kind of see if there's any kind of correlation there. But again, his agent also talked, just going on, this is so unlike him. He had to not be in his right mind. Obviously, all of us who knew Phillip are shaking our heads. He struggled away from the game. I tried to get him to come to Texas. I was going to find him a job, but he wouldn't leave South Carolina because he had a son. He was a good father, but I can't fathom it. He's shooting 2 kids. It's devastating for the families. And it gets that again. He was just earlier in that article, as I mentioned earlier, talking about how isolated Adams was. And especially, the working out 3 times a day to that level of intensity, you're really breaking your muscle tissue down at that point. You're not giving your muscles time to recover. It seems like a sort of, masochistic, lifestyle he was living. And I'm not going to get into speculating there. If you want to look at speculation on the internet, there's plenty of it on Twitter. But they did live near each other, and there's clearly an inability to transition. And it's not just about football. It's easy to put just all the blame on it. And there's certainly, there deserves to be a lot of that. But it's also a larger societal issue. I mean, beyond just football. I mean, we can see issues manifest within football, and they're visible because of the kind of the central place that has in our society as America's most popular sport. But these are issues that far transcend sport, and the American ruling class is more concerned about PR than they are about actually doing things to substantively change the dynamics that lead to these. And it's just obvious in what Joe Biden said. It kind of reminds you in how in Honduras you keep hearing Joe Biden talk about, we got to get to the root cause of what's causing people to migrate. Well, the root cause is you, Joe Biden. The root cause is overthrowing Manuel Zelaya. The root cause is allowing people like Juan Orlando Hernandez to stay in power. And I know that all does relate to this, because the U.S. empire and what they do abroad definitely affects how they view issues at home. And it's just the Travis Rudolph thing happening too. The level of violence. I mean, this is not someone who's just an inherently violent person. You've seen there's evidence, there's a life lived of doing good things. Something in him snapped, right? And they just individualize all the blame for that and guilt. Because it makes us feel better. We can kind of wash our hands off it. It is just the wrong thing to do. And we need to look deeper. And that's, I think, important and critical as our task of people that realize that this society needs to be transformed, and it can't just be cosmetic.
Absolutely. Well, we thank you so much, Nate, as always, for joining us today. We're going to leave it there, move to a break here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C., but we will be back. So please stay with us.
By any means necessary.